The first time I saw my husband truly afraid, not stressed, not frustrated, afraid, it was 8:47 on a Thursday morning in late October. Neil Sutherland stood at our kitchen island, holding his phone so tightly, the screen cracked along one corner. I remember that detail precisely. The sound it made, like something small and irreplaceable finally giving way. "What do you mean suspended?" His voice dropped to something I didn't recognize. "The CRA doesn't just. That's not how it works. I have people who handle this." I was standing near the window with my tea, watching the first real snow of the season drift past the glass. It had started sometime before dawn. The yard was already white. I didn't say anything. I wasn't surprised. And that, more than anything else, is what I need you to understand before I tell you everything that came before. My name is Rosemary Sutherland. I am 63 years old, and for most of my adult life, the people around me assumed I didn't understand money. That assumption didn't happen by accident. It was constructed, carefully, steadily, over decades, by the man I shared my life with. Before Neil, I worked as a financial administrator at a regional hospital in Edmonton. I was good at my job. I liked the orderliness of it, the way numbers revealed patterns that people couldn't hide. My mother used to tease me that I was too serious about spreadsheets for someone my age. I always took it as a compliment. I met Neil Sutherland at a professional conference in Banff when I was 27. He was 31, running a small property development company, out of Calgary, on ambition and confidence, and very little else at that point. He was funny and warm, and genuinely interested in what I had to say, at least in the beginning. We married 2 years later. I moved from Edmonton to Calgary. For the first few years, everything felt like a real partnership. We talked about money openly. He respected my instincts. I helped him review contracts on weekends, when his accountant was unavailable. Then our daughter Imogen was born. The shift was so gradual I almost missed it entirely. Neil's company started growing. One property became 5. 5 became a portfolio. Within a decade, Sutherland Developments was a recognized name in Calgary's commercial real estate market. And Neil had become someone who attended charity dinners and sat on business council boards and had his photograph in the Calgary Herald's business section. The more successful he became, the smaller I seemed to grow in the story he told about himself. I had stepped back from my career when Imogen was small, not because he asked me to, but because it made sense at the time. Neil was traveling constantly. Someone had to be home. I told myself it was temporary. Then years passed, and temporary became permanent, and I became the woman who managed the household while Neil managed the empire. The small comments started somewhere in the middle of all that. The first one I remember clearly was at a dinner party at our neighbor's home. A woman I had just met that evening asked my opinion about rising interest rates. Before I could answer, Neil laughed. "Oh, you're better off asking someone else," he said pleasantly. "Finance isn't really Rosemary's department." The table moved on. I smiled. I said nothing. But later that night, alone in the bathroom while Neil slept, I stood at the mirror for a long time. "Finance isn't really Rosemary's department," said so easily, so confidently, as though it were simply a settled fact about me, like my eye color or my height. It was not a fact. But over the years, I stopped correcting it. And that, I understand now, was the moment the lie began to take root. The comments became a pattern. Whenever finances came up at dinner parties, Neil would step in. "I'll handle this. Rosemary finds it all a bit dry." Whenever I offered an observation about the housing market or lending rates, he would smile gently and redirect. "She worries," he'd say, with that particular laugh, and people believed him. Gradually, even Imogen believed him. In the quiet way, children absorbed the stories their parents tell about the family. My son-in-law, Alistair Fenwick, was the one who first made me feel truly invisible. He was a project manager at a Vancouver engineering firm, competent, confident, the kind of man who assumed his opinions were always the most useful ones in the room. At a family Easter dinner 2 years ago, when the conversation turned to real estate, I made a comment about overvaluation in the Calgary condo market. Alistair listened politely, then turned to Neil. "What do you think? You've been through these cycles before." Not cruel, just absent, as though what I had said was background noise he had chosen not to tune into. I watched Imogen notice. She glanced at me briefly, something that wasn't quite an apology in her expression, and then the conversation moved on. These are not dramatic moments. I know that. But they accumulate. They become a weight you carry without realizing how heavy it has grown. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in August. I had been sorting through the mail on the kitchen counter. Bills, a pharmacy flyer, an envelope from a property management company I didn't recognize. I set it aside without much thought. Neil came home early that afternoon. He went straight for the mail, which he never usually did. I watched him from across the kitchen. He paused when he reached the unfamiliar envelope. Something passed across his face, just a shadow, and then he folded it without opening it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Anything interesting?" I asked. "Just paperwork," he said, already moving toward his office. I didn't push, but I thought about that envelope for days afterward. Not obsessively, just steadily. The way you think about something that doesn't quite fit. A few weeks later, I found the folder. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I was looking for our car insurance documents, which I needed for a claim. I knew Neil kept files in the lower cabinet of his home office. I had been in that cabinet before, years ago. The drawer opened normally. The files looked ordinary enough. Insurance records, property records, old tax returns. Then, tucked behind the hanging files and almost flush against the back panel of the cabinet, I found a large manila envelope held shut with an elastic band. I stood there for a moment. Then I opened it. Inside were incorporation documents for a company I had never heard of. Sutherland Pacific Holdings Limited, registered in Alberta less than 3 years prior. The registered address was a postal box in the downtown core. Neil had never mentioned it once. I kept reading. My name appeared on the 3rd page. Rosemary Sutherland, Director. I read it again. My hands had gone very still. I had never agreed to be a director of this company. I had never signed anything. I had never attended a single meeting, never seen a prospectus, never received any correspondence connected to it. I kept reading. My name appeared on page after page, authorized signatory, corporate officer, and on the signature lines, my signature, or something that looked very much like it. I know my own signature. I have been signing my name on documents for 40 years. The copies in my hand were not mine. They were very good. Whoever had created them had studied my handwriting carefully. But the loop on the capital R was slightly too generous. The tail of the final Y dropped a fraction too far to the right. Small things. The kind of things most people would never catch. I caught them, because these were precisely the kinds of details I had spent my career catching. I sat down slowly in Neil's office chair. There was a second folder beneath the first. Inside were bank records I had never seen. Accounts connected to Sutherland Pacific Holdings, with transfers that made me hold my breath. Some transactions involved hundreds of thousands of dollars. The money moved between accounts I didn't recognize, companies whose names meant nothing to me, and one account that made my stomach drop entirely. A retirement savings account in my name. My RRSP. The account I had started contributing to before I ever met Neil. The account I had always believed was separate from his business affairs, protected, mine alone. It had been pledged as collateral for a business loan I had never agreed to. I set the folder down carefully on the desk. I did not panic. I want to tell you that I panicked, because that would be a more comfortable story. Instead, I felt something settle into place inside me. Like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. The uneasy feeling I had been dismissing for years. The closed laptops, the late-night phone calls, the business trips that multiplied without adequate explanation. I had been right about all of it. I had simply been too trusting to follow the feeling where it led. I replaced the folders exactly as I had found them. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window for a long time. Then I drove to the Tim Hortons 2 blocks from our neighborhood and sat alone with a coffee, thinking carefully about what I had found and what I intended to do next. The name that appeared most frequently in the corporate documents, besides Neil's and mine, was Petra Novak. I searched her online that evening while Neil watched television in the next room. She had a professional website, a LinkedIn profile, an active presence at Calgary real estate industry events. She was 44 years old, listed as a real estate investment consultant. I searched more specifically. Industry event photographs, the previous 3 years. Neil appeared in several, and in more than a few, Petra Novak stood nearby. Always close, always comfortable, never quite touching but never quite separate either. Neil had mentioned a business contact named Petra exactly once, in passing, months ago, as though she were as significant as a parking attendant. He had not mentioned her since. I wrote her name down on a piece of paper. Then I called my oldest friend, Margot Beaumont. Margot and I had been close since university. She had become a lawyer decades ago, specializing in financial and property law out of a firm in Calgary. We had settled into the comfortable rhythm of old friends. Holiday calls, occasional lunches, but the warmth had never really faded. When I said, "Margot, I need to talk to you about something serious," she said without hesitating, "Come to my office tomorrow." I did. For 2 hours, I laid everything across her desk. The incorporation documents, the signature pages, the bank records, the RRSP connection. Margot read everything without interrupting me once. When she finished, she folded her hands and looked at me the way she had always looked at me, directly, without softening the edges of the truth. "Rosemary," she said, "do you understand what you're looking at?" "I think so," I said. "If these signatures are forged," she said carefully, "and your name has been registered as a corporate officer without your knowledge or consent, you may have legal and financial exposure you had no idea existed. Creditors can theoretically pursue you for obligations you never agreed to take on." "And the RSP?" I asked. "That is deeply concerning," she said. "That is your retirement security. It should never have been pledged as collateral without your explicit, written, documented consent." We talked for a long time. Margot couldn't tell me what to do yet, not without more information, but she helped me think clearly. In my experience, that is worth more than most people realize. On the drive home, I stopped at the bank. A branch advisor named Caroline, a steady, careful woman, reviewed what I brought her without visible alarm, which told me she was more alarmed than she was showing. She asked whether I had reviewed my registered accounts recently. I said I hadn't. She helped me do so. What I found confirmed what I had feared. My retirement savings had been linked to financial guarantees I had not authorized. The language was complex, but the meaning was not. My future had been used as a bargaining chip, without my knowledge, without my permission. I sat in the bank parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive. I had trusted Neil completely, not naively. I had simply trusted him the way you trust someone you have spent 35 years building a life beside. And he had taken that trust and used it to insulate himself from consequences he had known were coming long before I had any idea they existed. The family dinner the following Sunday was excruciating, in the way that only ordinary-seeming events can be excruciating when you are carrying an enormous secret of your own. Imogen and her husband Alistair had driven up from Vancouver for the weekend. We sat around the dining room table as we always did. Good food, ordinary conversation, the familiar rhythms of a family that, from the outside, looked entirely intact. Then Neil made a joke about me struggling to navigate the bank's mobile app. The story wasn't true, but Alistair laughed. Imogen smiled faintly. Neil looked at me with that particular expression, fond, dismissive, practiced, and I smiled back. But I was watching Alistair. Every time Neil discussed a property acquisition, Alistair's shoulders tightened very slightly. When Neil made the joke, Alistair's laugh arrived half a second late. When I casually mentioned that I'd been reviewing some account statements recently, Alistair set down his fork. Not bored, unsettled. 2 weeks later, I asked him to meet me for lunch. He arrived looking as though he hadn't slept well in months. We sat at a restaurant near his hotel, and for 10 minutes we talked about nothing. Then I placed my hands flat on the table and said quietly, "Alistair, I know about Sutherland Pacific Holdings." The color left his face completely. He didn't deny it, not a single word, and that told me everything. "How long have you known?" I asked. "About 18 months, he said. I sat with that for a moment. 18 months, nearly 2 years of family dinners, of Christmas calls, of watching Neil make jokes at my expense. 18 months of knowing. Neil told me it was temporary, Alistair said. His voice had gone very quiet. He said the company would be wound down, that your name would come off the documents. And you believed him? Alistair looked at the table. I wanted to. Then, after a long pause, he told me about the money. Neil had paid off a personal loan for him, $42,000, shortly after Alistair had first seen documents with my name on them. Imogen didn't know. She thought they had refinanced through a different lender. $42,000 for my son-in-law's silence, while my retirement savings sat pledged against debts I had never agreed to carry. When we left the restaurant, I sat in my car and let myself feel the full weight of it. Then I drove home and went back to work. The call from the Canada Revenue Agency came on that Thursday morning in late October. The agency had been conducting a quiet audit of Sutherland developments for several months. When the auditors began pulling at the corporate threads connecting the main company to Sutherland Pacific Holdings, they found patterns that required immediate action. The accounts were suspended pending a full review. Neil stood in our kitchen with his cracked phone screen and his white knuckles, and I watched him realize, for the first time, I think, that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed. I need to figure out what happened, he said when he finally looked at me. I know what happened, I said. He went very still. I sat down at the kitchen table. Sit down, Neil. He remained standing. He stared at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not yet. Something more like the moment before a person understands that the room they're standing in has no exit they hadn't noticed before. I found the documents, I said. The incorporation papers, the signature pages, the loan agreements. I paused, the account connected to my RRSP. The silence that followed was the longest of our marriage. That's not what it looks like, he said finally. I looked at him steadily. You've been saying some version of that to me for 35 years, I said. I'm done accepting it. I placed a folder on the table between us. Copies of everything I had found, and copied over the previous months, organized by date, the forged signatures, the corporate filings, the loan records, photographs from industry events, Neil and Petra Novak, comfortable in each other's proximity, across a dozen different occasions. Neil's face went through several things at once. Calculation, the search for an argument, the attempt to reassemble control. I had watched that process so many times over so many years. I had let it work on me once. I know about Petra Novak, I said. I know what the audit is going to find, and I know that Alistair has known for 18 months. Something in him seemed to give way then. Not collapse. Neil was never the kind of man to collapse visibly. But something underneath the performance finally buckled. How did you find all of this? He asked. His voice was quieter than I had heard it in years. I looked, I said. You spent 35 years telling everyone I didn't understand finance, but I never forgot how to look. He sat down, heavily. The way a person sits when their legs have decided the conversation is over, even if they haven't. What followed was a long and painful exchange that I will not reproduce in full, Neil explained. He minimized, he pointed to pressures I hadn't known about, decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, circumstances that had evolved in ways he hadn't anticipated. None of it amounted to a justification. He knew that. I knew that. When he finally left the kitchen and closed himself in his office, I stopped the voice recording I had started on my phone before he sat down. 39 minutes. Margot had suggested it. She said confrontations have a way of becoming contested later. That memories are unreliable. That documentation matters more than anything. She was right. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, and also, strangely, the clearest. Legal proceedings began slowly and expanded. The CRA investigation uncovered financial structures that Neil's lawyers struggled to explain adequately. The shell company, the forged authorizations, the retirement account used as collateral, each element compounded the ones before it. Alistair eventually told Imogen the truth. That conversation fractured something in their marriage that may never fully heal. Imogen called me afterward and cried for a long time, and I listened, because that was what she needed most. As for Petra Novak, I never confronted her. I considered it many times in the early months. But eventually I understood that the confrontation I needed most was not with her, or even with Neil. It was with the version of myself who had gone quiet when she should have asked questions. She was the one who needed answering for. Neil moved into an apartment in Beltline the following spring. When I saw him at mediation sessions, he looked older. A man whose certainty has run out looks different from a man who is merely tired. In the parking lot outside our mediator's office one afternoon, he stopped beside my car and said, "I never thought you'd figure it out." I considered that for a moment. "I know," I said. "That was your mistake." I sold our house in Springbank that autumn and bought a small house on Shuswap Lake in British Columbia. Modest, clean, surrounded by water and mountains, and a quietness I hadn't known I was missing. The first morning I woke there, I made tea and stood on the back deck watching the light come across the water. No files to review, no lawyers to call, no secrets to excavate. For the first time in a very long time, I felt entirely like myself. The following spring, I began volunteering at a community center in Salmon Arm that offered financial literacy workshops for women. Most of the participants were older, widows, divorcees, women who had spent decades trusting someone else to manage the accounts, and now found themselves navigating a language no one had ever taught them. I recognized every face, not because I knew them, but because I had been one of them. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't a financial advisor. What I was someone who had learned, at considerable cost, what it means to be disconnected from your own financial life. And I knew how to explain things clearly, because I had spent a very long time explaining them to myself. One afternoon after a session, an elderly woman, she must have been close to 80, using a cane, came up and took my hand in both of hers. "I spent 60 years trusting my husband with every dollar we had," she said. "I never asked a single question. I thought that was what love looked like." I held her hand. "I thought so too," I said. She squeezed gently. "Why did nobody ever tell us it was all right to ask?" That question stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that entire year. Neil sent me a letter in December, handwritten, which surprised me. It was 2 pages, not long. He did not explain or justify. He apologized, not primarily for the financial crimes, but for the years of dismissal. For teaching our daughter that I didn't know what I was talking about. For making me smaller so he could feel larger. I read it twice, then I put it in a drawer. I didn't need it to move forward, but I kept it, because it was true. People sometimes ask me what the worst part was. They expect me to say the forged signatures, or the RRSP, or the photographs of Petra Novak at real estate industry events. But the worst part was simpler than any of that. The worst part was the years I spent believing him. Not because I was naive. I was not naive. But because I had let someone else's persistent voice grow louder than my own. I had accepted the story he told about me, until I nearly forgot the one I knew about myself. I was good with numbers long before I met Neil Sutherland. I understood contracts and accounts, and the language of money, long before he rewrote me as someone who didn't. He could put my name on documents I never signed. He could pledge my savings as collateral for his secrets. He could shape the way our family saw me, year after year, dinner by dinner, small joke by small joke. But he could never touch the person I was before. He started telling everyone I didn't understand. That person was always there. She was simply waiting for me to stop doubting her. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you have ever been talked over, or talked past, or made to feel that your instincts about your own life couldn't be trusted, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment, tell me what you would have done, or what you did. Your story might be the one that gives someone else permission to start asking questions of their own. And if stories like this one speak to you, please subscribe and stay with us here at Silent Tear Stories. Thank you for being here with me today.